So the bubble burst for Job, beginning, which is, we think, the oldest Bible book or the first Bible book written. It begins because of a conversation that goes on in heaven between God and Satan. Job is that rare combination of person. He is the richest man in the world, and at the same time, he is the most righteous man in the world. Now, righteous and rich don't often mix very well. But in Job's case, they do. And God is proud of Job. And so he brags on Job to Satan. And Satan says, well, of course. He's righteous because he's rich. You take away his riches, you take away all of his stuff, and he won't be righteous anymore. In fact, he'll curse you to the face. God said, I don't believe that. And so God said, I'm going to prove it to you. Go ahead. Take some away from him. And Satan does. And in a matter of moments, he loses almost everything that he has or is except for he and his wife. 3 of his friends come and sit with him, beginning in chapter 2, and for the next 29 chapters, they accuse him, basically, in a series of dialogues and conversations. They accuse him of having sinned against God or offended God in some way, and he kept saying, no, I didn't. And not only that, he keeps questioning God himself. Until we get to chapter 32, where a younger man named Elihu steps in, and Elihu takes over for the next 6 chapters and has the longest piece of dialogue throughout the entire book. And Elihu basically says, God's going to show up here in a minute, and then he is going to take control of this situation. And he does. In a whirlwind, a hurricane, God shows up, and that's where we picked up last week. And God is going to spend chapters 38 through 41 asking Job some questions of his own. And so last week we began in chapter 38 looking at God's questions. And the reason I've slowed down a little as we get to the end, and I'm taking each of the chapters that deal with God's questions to Job individually and separately, is because I want you to see either the scientific foreknowledge that is in chapters 38, 39, and 40, and a little bit into 41 as well, or evidence for the proof of God, because that's the kinds of things God is going to ask Job about. And so last week in chapter 38, God started asking Job, if he's so smart, questions about the creation and about the earth. Next week, you're going to notice in the text, he's going to ask him some of the most controversial questions ever in the world of religion. But that'll be next week. Tonight, he's going to talk about animals, and we're going to sort of see God's animal kingdom. So if you love animals, can you switch me back up on the screen? If you love animals, you are likely going to really love the text tonight. We know this about God and animals. We know that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6 that God notices every single sparrow that falls down to earth and dies. Wow. The reason that was so significant is the sparrow is considered the most insignificant, the least important of the animals, and yet God notices every single one. And Jesus' point was, how much more then will he notice you? But tonight, we're going to see that God not only noticed every animal, God made every animal. Have you ever wondered how many animal species there are? About 1 million different species have been identified. Now that sounds like a lot, but 350,000 of those are insects. Actually, Terry Irwin of the Smithsonian Institute estimates that there are probably 30 million different species on the planet. So apparently, man thinks that man is at the top of the food chain, and man is just the latest example of evolutionary processes. I think the great white shark would probably disagree with us on that. But apparently that's what man thinks, and so God is going to start telling us what he thinks. here in chapter 39. Do you know when the wild goats give birth? God says to Job, have you watched as deer are born in the wild? And do you know how many months they carry their young? Are you aware of the time of their delivery? They crouch down to give birth to their young and deliver their offspring. I just love this. God changes from specific questions about the creation itself to the living objects in the creation. He's going to start with the animals. He's going to come to people later, but he's going to start with the animals. And so he asked, first of all, Job, do you know the gestation periods for animal reproduction? Now, he uses a couple of animals as an example of it, but he's really asking him, do you know the gestation periods for all of animal reproduction in the kingdom? Do you know that an elephant stays pregnant for 2 years? Did you know that? How many of you knew that? An elephant stays pregnant for 2 years. Did you know that an opossum stays pregnant for less than 2 weeks? How many of you knew that? You did know that, okay. And yet both produce healthy offspring. Who decides how long an animal is pregnant? Was that you, Job? Were you the one that was smart enough to decide that? Or how about this? Who gives the wild donkey its freedom? Who untied its ropes? I have placed it in the wilderness. Its home is the wasteland. It hates the noise of the city and has no driver to shout at it. The mountains are its pasture land, where it searches for every blade of grass. Wow. He's going to move on and say, I think we're missing verses 9 through 12. So what I need to, is it in the outline? Well, then I'll read it in the outline. In verses 9 through 12, he says, will the wild ox consent to being tamed? Will it spend the night in your stall? Can you hitch a wild ox to a plow? Will it plow a field for you? Given its strength, can you trust it? Can you leave and trust the ox to do your work? Can you rely on it to bring home your grain and deliver it to your threshing floor? Now, wild ox, you think ox today, wild ox is different from this. This was a reference to, and some translations actually say it, the auroch. It was a wild animal bigger than a hippo. It was wild and strong and ferocious. And plowing a field with it would be somewhat like plowing a field with an elephant. Today, it is extinct. In fact, it was last seen, I think it says this, no, it doesn't say this on this screen. It was last seen in Israel in 1627. So by the 17th century, it was extinct, and it was slowly going that way for hundreds of years before that. But that's the animal he's referring to here. But then he refers to an animal that's not only not extinct, but that we're all familiar with. The ostrich flaps her wings grandly, but they are no match for the feathers of the stork. She lays her eggs on top of the earth, letting them be warmed in the dust. She doesn't worry that a foot might crush them or a wild animal might destroy them. She is harsh toward her young as if they were not her own. She doesn't care if they die. Now that sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? Well, here's the reason why. Because she's dumb. She's stupid. The ostrich is a very interesting animal. It is the largest bird on earth. They can weigh up to 400 pounds. But they are, have you ever heard the old phrase bird brain? Somebody is a bird brain. Well, that's where it comes from. Literally, that's where it comes from. The ostrich is the ultimate bird brain. As the text says, the mother ostrich buries her eggs in the ground only to forget their location. And another might come and crush them, including herself. She's so stupid that she will go back and step on her own eggs, and ultimately, she doesn't really care if they die. And why, you might say, is the ostrich so stupid? Because God made her that way. Because God has deprived her of wisdom and has given her no understanding. Now you may ask, what has God got against the ostrich? You may ask, why did God make the ostrich so stupid? And I would say to you, that's for God to know and you to find out. When you get to heaven, feel free to ask. Feel free to ask. We don't know. We don't know. In today's advanced scientific and technological environment, we don't know. That's the answer to a lot of our questions about God. And while we're living in this world and on this earth, we need to get used to not knowing why. One of the commentaries that I read for this put it this way. It's as if God is saying to Job, get used to my absurdity and live by faith rather than by sight. For whatever reason, God made the ostrich stupid. But here's what else is true. Whenever she jumps up to run, she passes the swiftest horse with its rider. Wow. Why? Because God made her that way. Because God made her that way. An ostrich can outrun a horse doing 40 miles an hour. And there's a lesson here, and don't miss it. If you're stupid, you need to be fast. Very helpful. Sometimes doing stuff with a straight face is really hard. If you're stupid, it's better to be quick. It really is. Now, do we have any horse lovers here tonight? Anybody really loves horses? All right, this is for you. Have you given the horse its strength or clothed its neck with a flowing mane? Did you give it the ability to leap like a locust? Its majestic snorting is terrifying. It paws the earth and rejoices in its strength when it charges out to battle. It laughs at fear and is unafraid. It does not run from the sword. And God then continues his questions for Job. I'm going to skip a few verses for the sake of time into chapter 26. Is it your wisdom that makes the hawk soar and spread its wings toward the south? Is it at your command that the eagle rises to the heights to make its nest? It lives on the cliffs, making its home on a distant rocky crag. From there it hunts its prey, keeping watch with piercing eyes. Its young gulp down blood. Where there's a carcass, there you'll find it. The powerful eagle. And again, God's observations about nature and animals here are meant to humble Job. See, when Job was asking the questions, in his own mind, he was getting larger and larger and smarter, and God was getting smaller and smaller. But now that God is on the asking end, Job is the one shrinking, and God is growing in significance. The Lord continues over in chapter 40. Then the Lord said to Job, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? Well, I know what my answer would have been right then. You are God's critic. You have been God's critic. I listened to you rattle on for 29 chapters. But do you have the answers? Well, of course. You might think it's time for Job to put down his pencil and turn in the test and quit asking the questions. So Job replied to the Lord, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. Now, at first glance, just reading that, you think that Job got the message. Nope. He didn't. We're going to see that a little later. He simply goes from pounding on God to pouting about God. He simply goes from shaking his fist at God to sticking out his lip. He's saying, okay, God, you won. You've made your point. I get it. You're bigger than I am. So I'll just shut up and serve you. Job is agreeing to serve the Lord, but you can bet he is sort of agreeing to do so with a grudge. It's not really what he wants to do. He has accepted God's sovereignty, but he doesn't really like it. Now, at this point, I feel the need to pull over and park. Because I think some of us have enough spirituality within us and enough love of God and reverence for the Lord and maybe even enough submission to his will that we get to this point. We don't like what's happened. We don't understand what's happened. But we grudgingly accept it. Maybe even accept it from God with a pout. That's not where he wants us to be. God doesn't want us to pound on him or to pout about him. He wants us to get to the point where no matter what happens, we can praise him for who he is and for what he has done. And sadly, at the moment, Job was just pouting. He's giving in only because, well, basically he really has no other choice. So God, sensing his attitude and understanding he needs a little more attitude adjustment, continues on. He answers Job more from the whirlwind. Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Will you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove that you are right? That's a pretty good rhetorical question there. Will you discredit my justice and condemn me just to prove that you are right? Almost every time in my life where I have become hell-bent, bound and determined to prove that I'm right about something, it's turned out wrong. Because I'm human. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. I make mistakes. I err. Same question could be asked of me, probably of you. So instead of trying to answer God, let's see some personal applications that we can make from this section in chapter 39 and 40 for our lives. And the first one is a really encouraging one. And that is, God speaks to us in our storms. Now, God speaks to his children in many different ways. I mean, he came to Moses through a burning bush. He used a great fish, maybe a whale, to get Jonah's attention. He used a donkey to speak to Balaam. He even used a rooster to speak to Simon Peter. He speaks to Job out of a whirlwind. The word literally means hurricane, a huge storm. And so I grew up thinking the only way God speaks to us is through his word. Some of you heard that too. I don't believe that's true at all anymore. I don't. I think God speaks to us through his word, but I also think he speaks to us through other people. I think he speaks to us through circumstances. And sometimes I think he speaks to us the only way he can get our attention, and that is through a storm. I don't know when that is. I don't know what storms come to our life, and the only way God can get our attention is through them. I'm certainly not one who said 9/11 was God's getting our attention, or other terrorist attacks was God getting our attention, or a hurricane or a tornado was God. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm simply saying that there is example after example in Scripture of God using a storm in your life to speak to you, because maybe that's the only thing you really will listen to at that time. So, as hard as this is to hear, if you're ever going through a personal storm, or a financial storm, or a relational storm, or a spiritual storm, make sure you're listening for God's voice. Your storm may have nothing to do with that. Your storm may be caused totally by another person or another set of circumstances or situations. May be caused just by an evil world. But even if it's caused by those things, God can use it to speak to you. Why? Why does God use storms to speak to us? Well, some of us are so hard-headed that we really aren't paying attention when our emotional climate is sunny and mild. When our spiritual climate is sunny and mild. And so sometimes God may have to use storms to get our attention. He did with Jonah. And so many other instances I could give you. Annie Johnson Flint once wrote a beautiful poem about this. God hath not promised skies always blue, flower-strewn pathways all our lives through. God hath not promised sun without rain, joy without sorrow, peace without pain. God hath not promised we shall not know toil and temptation, trouble and woe. He hath not told us we shall not bear many a burden, many a care. God hath not promised smooth roads and wide, swift, easy travel, needing no guide, never a mountain rocky and steep, never a river turbid and deep. But God hath promised strength for the day, rest for the labor, light for the way, grace for the trials, help from above, unfailing sympathy, undying love. Like an old seaman once said, during the fiercest storm, the only way a ship can survive is to keep its nose pointed straight into the wind. If you try to turn to the left or to the right, the ship may capsize. If you try to run from the wind, the waves can surge over the stern. So you keep it pointed straight into the wind. Whenever you're in a storm, don't turn away from God. Don't run from Him. Instead, run straight toward Him. That's what God is saying to Job here. Here's another lesson I think we can learn from this, and that is we're voiceless before God's power and wisdom. Job just finally said, I cover my mouth. Now, earlier, Job had boasted in chapter 23, if I only knew where to find God, I would go to His court and I would lay out my case and present my arguments. And now he says, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. I have said too much already. I have nothing more to say. We're speechless, voiceless before God's power and wisdom. Job here sort of reminds me of the lion in the Wizard of Oz, who said, let me at him, I'll show him a thing or two. And then when he finally faced the wizard, he crouched in terror. Job was the same. Before God appeared, he boasted that he could get an audience with God and tell Him a thing or two. But when God appeared, he suddenly found himself speechless. When God showed up, he said, I am unworthy. I am nothing. When you find yourself in the awesome presence of God, you will discover all your questions and all your arguments vanish. Because here is the first spiritual law. Never forget this. Never, ever forget this. If you don't get this, you won't get anything else. It's that important. The first spiritual law is God and you are not. God is God and you are not. And God can do whatever He wants to do. And until you know a little more about running the physical universe, God told Job in chapter 38, you ought to keep your mind off the moral and the spiritual universe and running it. Until you know how to make and create all the animals, including designing and organizing their gestation period, you probably ought to take a back seat for a minute. I've heard people say, when I get to heaven, I'm going to have a lot of questions to ask God. I've probably said it myself years ago. I quit saying it a long time ago. Why? Because like Job, I want to believe that when we enter the presence of a holy God, we're going to realize real quick we are not in any position to ask God any questions. But we've only got 5 or 6 minutes left, so I got to get to this last main point, which is so important. And that is, when we yield to God's sovereignty, that's when we'll have peace. And that's the message God's trying to give to Job. Now, let me ask you, what does sovereignty mean? What does sovereignty mean? If I were to ask you to write me out a layman's definition of sovereignty in 10 or 12 words or less, what would you say? So I decided to do that myself. I thought, well, I'm going to ask, if write out in your mind a 10 or 12, and then I thought, I'm going to do it myself. I can't use more than 10 words. And here's what I came up with. God's right. I should have put, if I had this do over again, I'd have added one word. God's absolute right to do what He pleases. He's God and I'm not. He doesn't have to explain it to me at all. The root of the word sovereignty, you understand, is the word reign, R-E-I-G-N, and the prefix sov, S-O-V, means over. So it literally means to rule and reign over. God rules and reigns over all. He didn't owe Job any kind of explanation, and He doesn't owe me one either, and He doesn't owe you one either. Now, when you think of the sovereignty of God, the inevitable question arises, well, does man have a free will to choose, or is God in His sovereignty controlling everything? Does man have a free will to choose, or does God in His sovereignty control everything? It's also the basic question of predestination and foreordination. It's also the basic question of Calvinism. And the answer is yes and no. How do you balance the freedom and will of man with the absolute sovereignty of God? So lots of illustrations have been used, but the one I kind of like to use the best is because I think it's more understandable for all of us. We can all apply it. Let's imagine you go out here tonight after the service is over and you have your luggage and you get on an airplane at Southwest Regional to take an international flight to London. Well, the first step is you have placed your trust in the law of aerodynamics. And you've put your trust in the pilots. And you've put your trust in the engineers and the workmen at Boeing who designed and built the jet. And once you choose to board the jet, the determination has already been determined by the authorities. That's a faint picture, I think, of the sovereignty of God. He has already determined the ultimate destination of your life. That's why it's called predestination. But as a passenger on that jet, you aren't kept in chains that bind you to your seat. Just a seatbelt that can be unfastened when the captain turns off the seatbelt sign in the cabin. You have some choices. You can choose to eat some of that delicious airline food that they give you, or that they used to, or you can decline it. You can choose to eat some of those awful old peanuts they give you, or you can decline them. The flight attendant isn't going to force feed you. You can choose to watch a movie or not. You can choose on an international flight to walk around the cabin or not. Now, the whole while you're making those choices, you are still heading toward a predestined, a predetermined location, London. There's both freedom and sovereignty in play, and they don't contradict each other one way or another. You can even, if you're smart enough, figure out a way to exit the plane. Some people have. I don't recommend it. I didn't say you could figure out a way to exit it and live, but you can figure a way to get off the plane. Therefore, I don't think it's a biblical concept, the idea of once saved, always saved, no matter what you do with the rest of your life. You choose to exit God's will and God's plane. He said, you're like a dog returned to its own vomit, Peter wrote. He said, it would have been better if you'd never even known the gospel, is what he said. So there's both freedom and sovereignty in play. But generally, you're reaching the goal that God purposed in Christ before the world began, Ephesians 1, 4, and 5 says. And within that divine design, He has given us freedom to make moral and spiritual choices. Job had the freedom to either accept God's sovereignty with everything that happened in his life, or to curse God and die. He had the option. So do we. So do we. Have you truly made peace with God? Because you'll never experience peace until you hear His voice in the storm and you surrender to the truth of the first spiritual law that He is God and you are not, and that He is sovereign and we are not. But when you believe that, trust that, and live for it, you, like Job, can overcome anything that Satan or this world throws at you. That's one of the messages of the book of Job when your bubble burst.